Welcome to this short talk on Malcolm. Of course, I know I'm talking to the converted, but I thought it would be interesting just to remind ourselves what extraordinary mind and way of working that Malcolm had. So I've called this little talk Ciphers, Rows, Serials, Fugues, Sonata Form, and Cigarettes. I thought we'd just start with a little bit of music. Well, we'll be coming back to that shortly. What I really want to talk about is not what he wrote, but about the actual processes, how the music was transferred from head to paper. And the reason why these other chaps occur on this particular slide is because they all have something interesting in common, which is that their basic compositional process was rather similar. They all created the music in their head, and then transferred it to paper. And it was quite a chore. Mozart, you might know stories of him playing skittles, and he used to play skittles when he composed, because it was all there in his head, and he found the actual writing the notes down on the manuscript paper rather a chore, rather a tedious process. Britten and Schubert, rather similar. In light of what I want to really talk about, two comments, two famous quotations from Malcolm, very important. A composer should speak directly to his audience, and music should not be written for the intellectual satisfaction of a few, but rather the enjoyment of the many. And I think that's very interesting, because although Malcolm did indeed use all these extraordinary ways of composing, that nonetheless the music does continuously speak to his audiences. So let's have a look at Rose first, and let's go back to the wonderful Fifth Symphony. This particular row informs the entire Fifth Symphony. It's just a little musical germ, and in itself it's extraordinary how he comes up with it, because those 5 notes represent the keys of his first 4 and then Fifth Symphony. And an extraordinary idea. No one has ever done that before. And that's how the whole of the Fifth Symphony, as it were, was born. Here is the opening. It's this rather plaintive solo oboe playing the theme. So we're going to listen to that, and then I just want to show you one or two of the transformations of this melody that occur. Here's the lovely opening. So let's have a look at some of the ways that he transforms it, and some really are rather complex. So here's a rather chorale episode that comes a little bit later in the movement, and you really have to look carefully, but the chorale, the chords, the chordal progression is very much based on the notes. There they are, and you can hardly know it unless you know it. Hopefully this is going to play for us now. here's another example. There's a bit of an introduction to it, and then the sequence, the row comes a little bit further on in the actual recording. In the next one, the tune is really kind of a full-throated, big, romantic kind of exposition of it. So, Rose, let's also now have a look at some serials, as in the case of serial-style composition, very much started off by the second Viennese school, Schoenberg-Webern, who was the great exponent, really. And Malcolm does it, and his serial writing is extremely appropriate, it's accurate, it's absolutely... does what it should do, strict serial writing. And of course, and we all know that Malcolm was considered by many of the critics of the time as someone who didn't embrace 20th century techniques, but of course he did. But he did it in this rather clever way that no one really noticed, except people who did notice. They were rather few and far between. So here's his row, or two rows that he uses, and fascinatingly, he accommodates all these things in I don't know, could I say a rather mischievous way? So no one really knows, but he does. And this particular this row occurs at the beginning of the symphony, both in normal and retrograde version. So he does it all absolutely by the book, and creates some fascinating harmony out of these rows. And you'll recognise these as those famous pizzicato chords that come just after the oboe solo. Let's have a listen to that. You really wouldn't know, would you, unless you knew? Now, I've said that well, I haven't actually said, but there are layers to Malcolm's writing, and there's also the programmatic element, another layer. And there was a great interview, which I'm sure you probably all listened to or heard, with the lovely broadcaster Margaret Howard, and where she asked him about his writing, and he said this.
How much of your own private life and what has happened to you emotionally goes into the music?
Everything. I'm so glad.
And of course, this particular, the Fifth Symphony, is filled with memories of friends of mine that died young, as Malcolm himself said. Aubrey, his brother, Jack Thurston, the great clarinetist, Dennis Brain, the great horn player, David Paltengi, one of the great ballet dancers of the time, and of course his huge friend Gerard Hoffmann, and all of them are included in this symphony. It doesn't make it a sort of biographical symphony in a sense, but all these people occur. I'm not going to go through them all, but let me give you a couple of examples. This is one of my favourites. Gerard Hoffmann is there, and he occurs through the notes G and B, which you might be able to see in percussion too there to begin with. G and B. In the German way of spelling music, the note B is known as H, or the other way around, whichever way you like to think of it. So G-H, Gerard Hoffmann. And then he expands the idea when the celeste and the harp come in a little bit later, and with this heavenly sort of sound of, his poor old Gerard's up in heaven, and it's an extraordinary passage, this, whether you're just enjoying it from the sonic point of view, or indeed with knowledge of what Malcolm is actually saying here. A wonderful section. So let's have a listen to this bit here. Then there's a very touching tribute to Annetta Hoffnung, in the utterly Mahlerian, beautiful, slow movement. And the way he does it, similar way, Annetta Hoffnung, A-H, which transcribes from our musical kind of language into A-B. And, you know, the symphony goes on and on and on, composed and organised in this fascinating, complex, multi-layered sort of manner. But let's just have a listen to this beautiful opening, as you'll all know it, of course, but it's Annetta Hoffnung, the slow movement. Extraordinary opening. Peter Hayworth, a critic of the time, none of the four movements manifest the least organic structure. You know, how wrong could you possibly be? The work is an extraordinary organic piece, extraordinarily organic. You know, everything really comes out of those four notes. But he misses the point, Hayworth, obviously. He also wrote unperceptibly about the Fourth Symphony. He missed that as well. And it was a problem at the time. You know, he and so many other writers, critics, musicians at the time who were very pro the very modern style that was going on. In a way, I think we owe more than we realised to Malcolm, because he knew that if classical music, I think, was going to survive, it had to be accessible. And if music had gone down the path of Webern and the other modernists of that period, it probably would have disappeared by now, because so few people really could understand or enjoy that kind of music. Malcolm realised that we had to embrace these modern techniques, but it could be done in a way that's accessible. So, you know, there's an interesting case to say that maybe in his way, in some aspect, he really was part of saving the future of classical music. Just a few more thoughts. Fugues. You know, fugues is a very intellectual, academic way of writing music, and Malcolm was excellent at so doing. And you know, if you write an atonal fugue, you've got no way of saying whether it's very good or not, because anyone can really write an atonal fugue. But Malcolm doesn't. He writes some extraordinary fugues in his music. I just want to point one out, which is in the Symphony for Brass, in the fourth movement there, the second on that page. It's a double fugue, and it's brilliant. And so it goes on. Ciphers. Many composers have used ciphers to inform their melodic writing, giving it an extra musical meaning. Schumann was maybe one of the first. I'm not sure. There may have been others before Schumann. Schumann did this quite a lot. And of course, the Seventh Symphony is full of ciphers. In other words, Malcolm works out names and other things as well in other works, and they then become the tune. Let's just have a listen to the opening. So now, if we have a look at his sketches, we find, if we look carefully, all sorts of interesting things going on here. And if we then take them and analyse them a little bit more closely, we begin to find, and because he kind of worked it all out with alphabets and all this kind of thing, as did Schumann and the other composers, we begin to find there are ciphers here, and we begin to see that these different tunes actually are based on notes that spell, for example, people's names. At the beginning, we have Catherine, Robert, and Edward, Malcolm's three children, at the beginning of the Seventh Symphony. A little bit later on, those chords are formed of Sheila, Catherine, and Isabel, and that repeated string motif comes out of the Catherine motif. A little bit later on, there are all sorts of ways that he uses these ciphers to create the music. So let's just have another listen to this, and you'll hear some of these. And of course, you don't need to know any of this to enjoy the music, or to enjoy the power of the music. You know, the colour, the extraordinary communicative qualities of this music is there. But of course, if you do know about it, it adds a real fascinating light to what you're hearing. You know so much. There's so much there. And indeed, Piers Burton Page once wrote, the Seventh Symphony is one of the finest symphonies of the 20th century, or finest symphonies the 20th century has produced, which indeed it is. It's just an amazing work. Sonata form, sonata form, but isn't this just kind of something that Mozart did and composers of that sort of period? But Malcolm embraces all these in his own very individualistic kind of way. And he uses sonata form a lot in this wonderful piece, the Concerto for Two Violins. What Tim Bowers rather neatly calls a Passacaglia escalator. A Passacaglia is, as you probably know, a sequence of notes that are repeated over and over again that form the bass line, and particularly going back to Baroque. Brahms used Passacaglias as well, of course, in the Fourth Symphony famously and other works. But Malcolm does this brilliantly. And as you can see here, this tune goes up by semitonal steps. And that's how this particular movement works. This is actually the third movement of the concerto. There it is. I've just kind of pointed out a couple of the Passacaglia moments. So let's just listen to the opening of the third movement, knowing that it's a Passacaglia, this wonderful Passacaglia escalator. Well, it's a great work, and then if your ear is tuned into this, and you can hear this escalator of rising motifs, it makes it more fascinating still. Finally, maybe a little whimsically on my part, Cigarettes, which was really what formed this really quite a tough work, the Concerto for 28 Players. It was a commission for work for the English Chamber Orchestra, funded by Peter Stuyvesant Foundation. They're not really the people that we go to today, but there it is. It's a very academic work in certain respects, because it's maybe one of Malcolm's most seriously follows the rules of 12-tone writing. He has his row, retrograde, all sorts of transformations, and he does it absolutely properly. Having said that, it's a work that even in his almost sort of total serialistical style here, it's still very listenable to. Here's just a bit of it. So there we have it. And we're just going to end by hearing the end of the Fifth Symphony. Again, so we started with the beginning, we're going to end with the end. The end of the Fifth Symphony is extraordinary, really. You get this kind of Hollywood version of Gerard and Etta in that amazing tune. And then this rather sudden jolt as the music then gets very dark, and we have this rather reflective end quietly in E minor, in fact, obviously the key of the symphony. And what I think all this really represents is this kind of elitist versus accessible music debate that we have. And Malcolm, I think, understood it and thought about this very deeply, maybe at the front, maybe at the back of his brain. I don't know quite which bit, but it was definitely there. And what he's left us with is some extraordinarily accessible music, very much written within the style of the time, and it's kept music going. And other composers followed in his footsteps, really. In other words, they felt that they can write accessible modern music rather than what was coming out at the time, which was inaccessible and in a way may have spelt the end of classical music, because the audiences would have disappeared, really. So I hope you've enjoyed that little journey into the mind of a real master composer.